So Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman says that in order to wage war, a country must portray the enemy in a certain way. And every country in history must do this and has done this with no exceptions. Can any of you guess what that way is? How must a country portray an opposing group of people in order to wage war against them? What must a country do? Dehumanize them. The country must dehumanize them. Must take away their humanity. Remember, tens of thousands of wars in human history, not a single war where dehumanization didn't occur. Every single war requires dehumanization. And this is done through what Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman calls distance. And he talks about three kinds of distance. The first form of distance is psychological distance. Psychological distance means portraying people as subhuman. And this is often done through derogatory name-calling. And in Non-Killing, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman talks about how our own country has used derogatory name-calling in war to portray people as subhuman. So what do we call the Germans when we fought them?
Krauts.
Krauts, right? And keep in mind there's multiple racial slurs for every ethnic group. What do we call the Japanese when we fought them?
Japs.
Japs. What do we call the Vietnamese when we fought them? Gooks. And what do we call people we're fighting in the Middle East? One thing you always hear in the media now is terrorists. And the way that word is used, you would think everybody in the Middle East is a terrorist. And this goes way back. What did the ancient Greeks call all non-Greeks? Thousands of years ago. What did the ancient Greeks call all non-Greeks?
Barbarians.
Barbarians, exactly. Barbarians. Any of you know where the word barbarian came from? It was a way of making fun of how people talked. The Greeks believed that if you weren't speaking Greek, that when you talked, it sounded like you were saying bar, 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 bar. So they called those people barbarians. So making fun of how people talk and saying that they're making animal noises is a subtle way to dehumanize them. A more overt way can be seen during the Rwanda genocide. Have any of you seen the movie Hotel Rwanda? What did they call the people being massacred? Remember? On the radio, what did they call them?
Cockroaches.
Cockroaches. Exactly, cockroaches. And I talked to a guy who actually survived the massacre. He told me another thing they called them was snakes. Snakes. Cockroaches and snakes. And the second form of distance is moral distance. Moral distance means that it's easier to drop. Moral distance means I'm good, you're evil, and God is on my side. That is why civil wars are so bloody. Because during a civil war, you look like the people you're fighting. You have the same language, customs, and traditions as them. So moral distance is used to make people believe that if you kill the enemy, you're expelling evil from the world. So psychological distance convinces people that they are not killing human beings, but subhumans and cockroaches. And moral distance convinces people that they're not killing human beings, but monsters and evil. And that makes moral distance very deadly. The cover of my second book, I'll pass it around after my talk, but it's a sculpture from 1810 that Napoleon had commissioned. And Napoleon had this sculpture commissioned in 1810 at the height of his power. And it's a picture of Napoleon being crowned with a laurel wreath. And in ancient Rome, the laurel wreath signified military victory. But if you look at the sculpture, you have to look at what's crowning him with the laurel wreath. And it's an angel. So Napoleon had a sculpture commission of an angel crowning him with a laurel wreath. And it shows you how Napoleon saw himself. People who engage in conquest, they think that God has chosen them to engage in conquest. So God is always on my side. I'm good. You're evil. God is on my side, and He wants me to kill you. That's moral distance. The third form of distance is mechanical distance. Mechanical distance means that it's easier to drop a bomb on someone at 10,000 feet than it is to shoot them with a rifle at 300 yards. It's easier to shoot somebody with a rifle at 300 yards than it is to stab them with a knife at close range. So the farther away you are from someone, the easier it is to kill them. That makes sense, right? It's easier to kill people if they look like ants than if they look like your family. So here's a question. Why did the Nazis use a gas chamber? Why do you think the Nazis used a gas chamber?
Efficient.
That's actually a myth. That's a good point. I think a lot of people think it's because it was efficient. That's actually a myth, though. Because there's nothing more efficient than a firing squad. There's nothing more efficient than lining people up, making them dig a ditch to become their grave, making them stand in their grave, shooting them with inexpensive bullets and throwing dirt on top of them. There's nothing more efficient than that. And the Nazis killed nearly 1 million people with firing squads. Before they switched to the gas chamber, they killed nearly 1 million people with firing squads. But they switched to the gas chamber because so many Nazi soldiers were becoming traumatized from killing women and children. So gas chamber is impersonal. One person can do a lot of killing and don't have to look at the people being killed. Yes?
But the gas chambers have viewing slots all around them.
Right. Well, typically, the way the gas chamber would work, there's a really good PBS documentary about it, and there's 2 good books about it. One's called Architects of Genocide. Typically, one person would kill everybody. It'd be like one person in charge. And that person didn't have to look in the slits if they didn't want to. And if you have a firing squad, I mean, you're killing women and children 10 hours a day, every day, and the Nazi soldiers had mothers, many of them had sisters, some of them had daughters. And a lot of soldiers were becoming traumatized. But the gas chamber, you close people off, and I mean, if you don't have it closed off, the gas will escape and kill the person watching. Going back to that 2%, the Nazi commanders were the ones positioning Heinrich Himmler, telling him, look, we have to change the method of execution to protect the executioner. And there were some Nazis who enjoyed watching people die. There was this one story in the book about this guy tells an account of how they were going through and they were asking all these villagers if they had any, I think they were looking for Jews. And they went to this one woman's house and asked her if she knew where any Jews were, and she said she didn't know. And this one Nazi, she was holding an infant, like a little infant, and this one Nazi took the infant and grabbed it by its legs and smashed its head against the wall. And the guy who was writing the account said he threw up when it happened. Like, whenever he hears that sound, he gets sick to the stomach. I mean, some people can handle that, but the point was that most of the Nazis couldn't handle it. Some of them can. And those are the ones they would try to get for the Einsatzgruppen. And a lot of the people in the Einsatzgruppen, they were committing suicide and they were becoming alcoholics and drug addicts. So, going back to that 2%, some people can handle it, but most people can't. So, good point though. And afterward, we can talk about Rwanda if you want to, in the question and answer session. Because Rwanda is very interesting, how people were able to hack each other up with machete. That's a different kind of thing going on. So in the question and answer session, if you want to talk about that. But, so, it's all about protecting the executioner. That's what it came down to. So when people are being executed, whether it's firing squad or hanging or electric chair, why are their faces almost always covered? Is it for their benefit? It's so the people watching the execution don't become traumatized. When gangsters execute people, where do they almost always shoot them? When gangsters execute people, where do they almost always shoot them? Back of the head. Back of the head. Gangsters, hardened criminals shoot people in the back of the head because they don't want to see someone's face when they die. That shows you how universal that is. Do you want to tell a story about your uncle real quick, or great uncle?
I don't mind.
Can you tell it real quick?
If you want,
Yeah,
it's not my uncle. I didn't know that my uncle was a colonel. He was the chief medical officer in World War II with Patton. And when he was with General Patton, and for the rest of his life, he himself was suffering from depressions and couldn't get over it. But he was with General Patton when Patton went into his first concentration camp. I don't know if some of you have seen the picture of Patton. Patton had an image of a really tough guy. And he said when they entered the concentration camp, he had never seen a human being become as white as Patton became. He didn't think, he with almost no blood in his face. In fact, Patton became absolutely white and then ran around to the back of a building that was right there and threw up. And started, heaved up and threw up and threw up. And then after he was done, came back out and then ordered that all the films, people were taking films, ordered all the films be confiscated and destroyed, and refilmed the whole entry into the concentration camp after he had composed himself so he could maintain his image of being this tough guy.
So contrary to Hollywood, most people can't handle seeing stuff like that. And one thing we know about Hitler is Hitler couldn't stand to see dead bodies or people who were maimed or bloody or injured. Hitler couldn't stand to see it. And that's a good story, too, where Patton vomited when he saw those dead bodies. That's why you have to protect the executioner through those methods that are a little bit more impersonal. Thanks, John. In addition to the mechanical distance of the gas chamber, the Nazis also used psychological distance by calling people subhuman, and the Nazis used moral distance by calling people evil. If the Nazis would have said all human beings are people like us, do you think the Holocaust would have ever happened? Of course not. A massacre as big as the Holocaust requires all three forms of dehumanization: psychological, moral, mechanical distance. But think about that. If human beings are naturally violent, why would every country in history, without a single exception, have to dehumanize the enemy in order to wage war? Why would every country in history, without one exception, have to create distance in order to wage war? And why would it be so hard to hurt or kill somebody if you see that person as a human being? If you look at somebody and think that person's like me, it's very hard to hurt or kill them. If you look at somebody and think that person has hopes and fears and dreams like I do, that person feels joy and pain like I do, that person has a family like I do, it's very hard to hurt or kill them. So I think the idea that we're not naturally violent, which all of military history supports, is very uplifting, because it's also the idea that at our core, we're not so bad after all, and that there is some hope for the human race. And where does dehumanization come from? Where does it come from? Where does dehumanization come from? Well, here's a good quote from George Orwell. George Orwell said, one of the most horrible features of war is that all the hatred, all the lies, all the propaganda always comes from people who aren't fighting. So it always comes from civilians, people in the media. Going way back, it comes typically from people who aren't fighting. That's where the war propaganda comes from.